On the morning of June 1st, 1962, the city of Novocherkassk woke up as it always did. Factory sirens sounded. Workers walked toward the massive Novocherkassk electric locomotive plant, one of the largest industrial sites in southern Russia. Nothing suggested that by the end of the next day, soldiers would be firing live ammunition into a civilian crowd. The Soviet Union officially had no strikes, no protests, no public unrest. According to the state narrative, the working class was already victorious. Reality was different. That morning, workers learned two things almost simultaneously. First, meat and dairy prices across the country had been sharply increased. Second, production quotas at the plant were raised, effectively lowering real wages. People would work more, they would earn less, and food would cost more. The timing was not accidental, but it was disastrous. For years, workers had been told that sacrifices were temporary, that life was steadily improving, that the state was moving toward abundance. Now, the promise collapsed in a single announcement. Anger did not explode immediately. It accumulated. Inside workshops, conversations changed tone. Machines kept running, but attention drifted. Men gathered in small groups, doing calculations in their heads. What they earned, what they spent, what was left. For many, the answer was nothing. By midday, work slowed, then stopped. Someone refused to return to their station. Someone else followed. Within hours, hundreds of workers were standing outside the plant gates, not shouting, not violent, simply refusing to continue. This alone was unprecedented. In the Soviet system, protest was not a recognized action. There were no legal mechanisms for dissent, no channels for negotiation outside party structures. When workers stopped working, the system had no script. Local officials were summoned. Factory management attempted to calm the situation. Words were exchanged, then a sentence that would echo through the city. According to multiple testimonies, a plant official told the workers, "If you don't have money for meat, eat liver pie." The phrase spread instantly. What had been frustration became humiliation. By late afternoon, workers began leaving the factory grounds and moving toward the city center. They carried no weapons. They carried no banners prepared in advance. Slogans were improvised, crude, direct. They were not calling for revolution. They were calling for food, for wages, for dignity. Novocherkassk was not prepared for this. Neither was the state. The protest in Novocherkassk did not begin with politics. It began with arithmetic. For years, the Soviet economy had relied on a simple promise: stability in exchange for loyalty. Wages were modest but predictable. Prices were controlled. Shortages existed, but they were explained as temporary difficulties on the road toward a better future. By the early 1960s, that promise was wearing thin. The country was emerging from the post-war period, but growth was uneven. Heavy industry received priority. Military production expanded. Consumer goods lagged behind. Food supply, especially meat and dairy, remained strained. Rather than increase production quickly, the state chose a different solution. Prices were raised. On June 1st, 1962, official announcements confirmed what rumors had already suggested. Meat, butter, and other basic food products would become significantly more expensive. For families living paycheck to paycheck, this was not an inconvenience. It was a crisis. At the same time, management at the Novocherkassk electric locomotive plant announced higher production norms. Workers would be expected to produce more units for the same pay. In practice, this meant a reduction in real wages. The two decisions reinforced each other. Higher prices reduced purchasing power. Higher quotas increased physical strain. Together, they erased the margin that had allowed workers to cope. Novocherkassk was not a peripheral town, it was an industrial center. The plant employed tens of thousands of people and symbolized Soviet technological strength. Its workers were skilled, disciplined, and accustomed to hard labor. They were not used to being ignored. Inside the workshops, discussions became increasingly direct. The language was not ideological, it was practical. How much does meat cost now? How much do we earn per shift? How many hours does it take to feed a family? The answers did not align with official assurances. Workers approached foremen. Foremen escalated concerns upward. Management responded with prepared statements and vague promises. No concrete relief was offered. The system assumed compliance. What it underestimated was exhaustion. Many workers had already been living close to the edge. Overtime had become routine. Equipment was aging. Safety standards were inconsistently enforced. The idea that productivity could be increased without consequence was deeply resented. The insult delivered by a factory official, suggesting that workers eat cheaper substitutes if they could not afford meat, did not create the protest. It crystallized it. In Soviet culture, public humiliation carried particular weight. Respect for labor was a foundational myth. To imply that workers should simply accept declining conditions struck at that myth directly. The response was spontaneous, but not chaotic. Work stoppages spread through departments. Small groups merged into larger ones. People who had never protested before found themselves standing beside colleagues, uncertain but unwilling to return to their machines. There was no leadership structure, no central organizer. This made the situation more dangerous, not less. Without a clear interlocutor, authorities could not negotiate. Without clear demands, they could not contain the movement. What they faced was a collective refusal, a pause in the machinery of the state. By the afternoon, it became clear that this was no longer a workplace dispute. Workers left the factory grounds and moved toward the city center, where administrative buildings and party offices were located. Their presence was calm but deliberate. They wanted to be seen. They wanted to be heard. Local officials reported the situation to higher authorities. Messages traveled quickly up the chain of command. What reached Moscow was alarming. A city was protesting, not intellectuals, not students, workers. In a system built on the claim that it represented the working class, this was an existential contradiction. The response would not be economic, it would be political, and soon it would be military. By the evening of June 1st, Novocherkassk no longer felt like an ordinary industrial city. What had begun as a work stoppage at a single plant was now spilling into the streets. Workers moved in groups, not rushing, not hiding. They crossed familiar routes, from factory districts toward administrative centers, routes normally used for parades and official demonstrations. This time, there were no banners prepared in advance, no slogans approved by committees, no organizers coordinating movement. What unified the crowd was shared experience. People spoke openly as they walked, about wages, about prices, about the sense that something fundamental had shifted. Many were unsure what they expected to happen next. Some assumed officials would come out and talk. Others believed the situation would resolve itself once higher authorities were informed. There was still an assumption of dialogue. As the crowd grew, so did its visibility. Residents who had not been at the plant stepped outside to watch. Some joined, others stood silently, observing from sidewalks and balconies. By nightfall, the city was fully aware that something unusual was happening. Local authorities attempted to regain control through familiar means. Police units were deployed, but not in large numbers. Their presence was cautious. Officers monitored movement, reported crowd size, and avoided confrontation. They were not equipped for mass unrest. During the night, communication intensified between local officials and regional leadership. Reports emphasized the scale of participation and the absence of violence. The situation was described as unstable but manageable. That assessment would not last. On the morning of June 2nd, workers returned to the city center. This time, their numbers were larger. Word had spread. Entire families appeared. Some people brought children, believing this would discourage force. Slogans emerged organically. They were simple and direct: calls for fair wages, demands for affordable food, appeals to party leaders to intervene. There were no anti-Soviet chants in the beginning. That distinction mattered. For many participants, this was not a rejection of the system. It was an appeal to it. They believed the state had made a mistake, and that the mistake could be corrected once properly acknowledged. Crowds gathered near administrative buildings. Windows remained closed. Officials did not appear. The absence was interpreted as indifference. As hours passed, frustration deepened. Some slogans grew sharper. References to broken promises became more explicit. The language shifted from economic demands to moral accusations. The crowd was still unarmed, still largely orderly, but no longer patient. At this point, the nature of the protest changed in the eyes of the authorities. What had been framed as a labor dispute was now seen as a threat to public order. The presence of families, the unpredictability of movement, and the visibility of dissent created a scenario the system was not designed to tolerate. Requests for reinforcement were approved. Military units stationed nearby were alerted. Armored vehicles were prepared. Orders were issued, though not yet made public. The response was escalating beyond civilian control. Most people in the crowd did not know this. They saw soldiers arriving and assumed they were there to maintain peace. Some believed the army would protect them from police action. The idea that troops might be used against civilians was still unthinkable to many. The city had awakened. So had the state, and both were moving toward a confrontation neither side fully understood. The decision to involve the military was made quietly. There was no public announcement, no warning to the city. Orders moved through command channels, framed as a precautionary measure to restore order and protect key facilities. By the early hours of June 2nd, army units were already on the move. Soldiers entered Novocherkassk from multiple directions. Armored vehicles rolled through streets that had seen nothing more threatening than factory traffic. Tanks were positioned near administrative buildings, communication hubs, and major intersections. For most residents, this was the first sign that the situation had crossed an invisible line. The presence of the army immediately changed the atmosphere. What had felt like a tense but negotiable protest now carried the weight of state power. Uniforms, weapons, and military discipline replaced the uncertain authority of local officials. Yet the deployment was deliberately restrained. Weapons were visible but not raised. Vehicles were positioned, not advancing. Soldiers stood in formation, awaiting further instructions. To outside observers, it appeared as a show of force rather than a preparation for violence. This ambiguity was intentional. Authorities hoped that the mere presence of troops would disperse the crowd, that people would see tanks in the streets and return home, that order could be restored without confrontation. This assumption was based on a misunderstanding. The crowd did not interpret the military presence as a threat. Many saw it as confirmation that their concerns had finally reached higher levels. Some believed the army had been sent to protect them from police or to pressure local officials into negotiations. This belief was reinforced by decades of propaganda portraying the military as a force aligned with the people. Workers approached soldiers. Conversations occurred. In some cases, troops responded politely but avoided engagement. They had not been briefed on how to address civilians making economic demands. They had been briefed on discipline. As the day progressed, crowd density increased. People gathered near the city party committee building and along main avenues. Movement became more fluid and less predictable. Small groups broke off, rejoined, and repositioned. From a military perspective, this was a deteriorating situation. Commanders reported difficulty maintaining clear zones. Lines between protesters and soldiers blurred. The risk of accidental contact, provocation, or panic increased with every hour. Inside administrative buildings, officials debated next steps. Some advocated for dialogue. Others warned that any concession would set a dangerous precedent. The memory of earlier unrest in other parts of the country influenced decision-making. No one wanted to be responsible for appearing weak. Orders were refined. Rules of engagement were discussed, though not always clearly communicated. Some units were instructed to prepare for crowd control. Others received more ambiguous directives, emphasizing the need to prevent the occupation of key sites by any means necessary. The language was deliberately vague. By early afternoon, the situation had reached a point of no return. The crowd was not dispersing. Officials were not appearing. The military was entrenched. The city center had become a pressure chamber. One final attempt was made to address the crowd. Statements were broadcast. Appeals for calm were issued. They were general, impersonal, and offered no concrete solutions. They failed. What followed was not immediate gunfire. It was a period of tension, minutes that stretched into hours, during which both sides waited for the other to retreat. Neither did. At some point, authority shifted fully from civilian administrators to military command. With that shift, the rules changed. The tanks had not been brought to negotiate. They had been brought to ensure compliance. The question was no longer whether force could be used. It was when. The order was not announced publicly. It did not arrive as a single clear command echoed across the square. Instead, it moved through layers of authority, fragmented, conditional, and shaped by fear of losing control. By early afternoon on June 2nd, civilian administration had effectively stepped aside. Responsibility for the situation in Novocherkassk had shifted to military command. From that moment, the protest was no longer treated as a social or economic dispute. It was treated as a security threat. Reports sent upward emphasized instability. Crowds were described as unpredictable. Slogans were increasingly portrayed as anti-state, regardless of their actual content. The presence of families and children was reframed not as restraint, but as disorder. Within this framework, the use of force became acceptable. Units were repositioned. Soldiers were instructed to secure key areas and prevent further movement toward administrative buildings. Some received ammunition. Others were told to stand by. The instructions varied between units, contributing to confusion on the ground. No clear evacuation of civilians was ordered. The crowd, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of how close it was to catastrophe. People stood facing soldiers, talking among themselves, waiting for something to happen. A speech, a concession, a decision. What they received was gunfire. Accounts differ on the exact sequence of events. Some witnesses recalled warning shots. Others remembered no warning at all. What is consistent across testimonies is the suddenness. Shots were fired into the crowd. People ran. Some fell immediately. Others did not understand what was happening until they saw blood. The firing was not sustained, but it was decisive. Panic spread faster than the bullets themselves. Individuals attempted to flee in every direction. Some were trampled, others were hit while trying to escape. The square emptied quickly. When the shooting stopped, the ground was scattered with the wounded and the dead. Official numbers would later minimize the toll, but eyewitness accounts and later investigations indicate that dozens were killed and many more injured. There was no public announcement of casualties. The military secured the area. Bodies were removed, streets were cleared. By evening, Novocherkassk appeared calm again, as if nothing had happened. That calm was enforced. Hospitals were placed under surveillance. Doctors were instructed not to discuss the nature of injuries. Families searching for missing relatives were given no information. Some were told their loved ones had been detained. Others were told nothing at all. The city was sealed in silence. Those who had fired did not speak publicly. Those who had given the orders did not appear. Responsibility dissolved upward into the system where it could no longer be clearly assigned. What remained were questions without answers. Who authorized live ammunition? Who decided the crowd could not be allowed to stand? Who accepted the consequences? These questions would not be addressed for decades. For Novocherkassk, the protest ended not with negotiation, but with force. The message was unambiguous. Public dissent would not be tolerated, even when it came from workers, even when it came without weapons. The state had made its position clear. The cost would be paid quietly. The shootings did not end the operation. They marked the beginning of containment. Within hours, the city was placed under informal lockdown. Military patrols controlled key intersections. Plainclothes security officers appeared near hospitals, morgues, and administrative buildings. Movement was monitored. Conversations were noted. The first priority was not medical care. It was control of information. The dead were removed quickly. Bodies were taken from the streets before dawn, transported away from the city center. Families were not informed immediately. In many cases, they were not informed at all. Funerals were not allowed. Instead, burials were conducted in secrecy. Victims were interred in different cemeteries, sometimes hundreds of kilometers apart, to prevent collective mourning. Graves were unmarked or falsely labeled. Relatives were warned not to speak publicly. Silence was enforced through fear. Hospitals were instructed to classify injuries carefully. Gunshot wounds were recorded under vague diagnoses. Doctors were questioned. Nurses were monitored. Any attempt to document events outside approved language carried consequences. Those who had been present at the protest were identified. Arrests followed. Some people were detained immediately. Others were summoned days later, questioned about their role, their words, their associations. Participation in the protest was reframed as criminal behavior. Charges were prepared quietly. Trials were swift and closed. Sentences were severe. Long prison terms, labor camps, lives redirected permanently. The goal was not justice, but deterrence. The message was clear. What had happened must never happen again. Publicly, the event was erased. No mention appeared in national newspapers. No explanation was offered. Official silence replaced gunfire. Within days, Novocherkassk returned to work. The plant resumed production. Sirens sounded as usual. On paper, order had been restored. In reality, the city had been broken. People learned what could not be said. Children learned what questions not to ask. The memory of the protest survived only in fragments, whispered at home, shared privately, passed between generations without confirmation. For decades, the state maintained the fiction that nothing extraordinary had occurred. The workers had returned to their machines. The streets were quiet. The files were sealed. It would take more than 30 years for the truth to emerge officially. By then, many of those who had been shot were already gone, not only from the city, from history.